Let's talk about The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This is a nice 1936 Everyman's edition, decorated by Eric Revilius, whose paintings you should look up. But The Warden is the first Barsetshire novel, which was a series of novels around rural church life. I'll explain why this is interesting in a minute. But rural church life in the 19th century, the early 19th century, I suppose. Trollope was a writer in the mid-19th century. The Warden specifically is a story. I'm going to describe some of these points in more detail than you'd expect, but because the central dilemma is really important. It's a story about the conscience of a Victorian clergyman, a Church of England priest who has a particular conscience issue, a particular torment, which he has to resolve and which people around him make hard to resolve. And that is a good enough plot in its own. That sounds interesting, but the details of the conscience torment, as well as kind of some of these surrounding things, will explain why I think this is an interesting book better. The actual problem is a really niche thing to do with church finance, well, not law, but church finance systems. Basically, 400 years before the book starts, a rich man had died and left his money to create a hospital. That actually means like a place for the poor, for poor pensioners in this case, poor old people. And he had said, okay, well, they'll have, I think it's 12 pence a day or whatever it might be, and the rest will go to a warden who will work at the cathedral, will be a priest, and they will get the remainder. But because of urbanisation, because the land that had been the basis of the rents for this has been built on and is now very valuable in this kind of regional cathedral city, because it's so much more valuable, so much more money comes in. But the will says you can the beadsmen, the old men, get 12p a day, 12 pence a day, and the rest goes to the warden, who therefore gets an enormous amount more money than was originally envisioned. And the conflict is that a reforming young man wants to stop this and change this and make it so that the poor old men get more of the money, whilst the really not the bishop, not the local bishop, but his son, the archdeacon, who's really the leader of the church locally, wants to stop this from happening because really this just undermines the church's ability to do stuff and its authority and its status. And it might be natural, of course, to sympathise with the crusading young lawyer, but there are ways in which you realise that there's not actually great interest in the prospects of these poorer people in the reforming camp. The real complication, one of the real complications, is that the archdeacon and the reforming young lawyer are respectively the son-in-law of the warden and the future son-in-law of the warden. And so one complication is that this old man, who's really quite a nice guy, he gives extra money out of his own pocket to the beadsmen, and he's really good friends with the bishop, and they like to sit together and play music and talk about things. Really just lovely old men. So he has this domestic problem where his son-in-law and his future son-in-law are fighting, and that endangers the prospects of the one daughter he has at home with him. But of course, that's the kind of domestic conflict, which is itself stressful enough, because you think, well, is Eleanor, his daughter, going to find her way to marriage, and is he going to end up pouring out on the street because of this, the lawsuit that's being brought against him? And there's some issues about there's some interesting legal detail about, well, what are the legal rights and wrongs here potentially? But the conflict of conscience is obviously the bigger thing, and it's that this nice old man who is nice to his beadsman, who tries to do his job, is faced with the tension of either standing on what he maybe are his legal rights of getting all this money and having his position at the cathedral, enjoying his time with the bishop, or giving all that up, or he fears giving all that up, and having to be much poorer, much more vulnerable. But where his conscience can be clean that he hasn't stepped beyond the limits of the will of John Hiram, the guy who founds Hiram's Hospital. Now, I'd say Mr. Harding, Septimus Harding, the warden, is a wonderful character. That's one thing. The biggest thing here is Trollope has a lovely style. It's very chatty, slightly in a way that you'll know what I mean. People will like this if they like 19th century novels. A slightly patronising tone, a slightly high overall Thorian and chummy tone. But his characters are excellent and deep. His big strength is painting in these characters. It's not a particularly long book. In smallish but not tiny text, in digest-sized pages, it's 300 pages. You can see it's not enormously long. But the detail given to characters like Mr. Harding and Eleanor and John Bold and the Archdeacon Grantley, as well as Mr. Grantley, the Archdeacon, as well as his father, the Bishop. These were all really wonderfully done. The plot itself is, so far as it serves the purposes of this character conflict, really solid. The dialogue is funny. There's lots of good things like that. The biggest criticism, and for some people this will not be a criticism, some people will like this, is that even for a relatively short 19th century book, it is terribly rambling at points. There are 2 to 3 chapters, depending on how you define it, which basically, and I think I worked this out, which take up about 8 plus 15, so 23, plus another 12, 44 pages. So nearly a sixth of the book, certainly over 10% of the book, is taken up by a series of chapters around the newspaper, the Jupiter, which really slanders, libels Mr. Harding quite badly in a very unfair way, as basically a thief. But then also about the personality of the chief writer, the editor, and the ways in which the media works in London. And this is just Trollope's kind of bonnet, really, the bee in his bonnet at that point. And it's enjoyable, it's really well written, but it is not really always to the point. And so there are a few things like that. That's the really egregious example. But there are a couple of times where you're like, okay, I really like the characters and I really like the conflict or the set of conflicts at the centre of this. I guess the dual conflict, Mr. Harding's conscience and the romance between Eleanor and John Bold. But I don't really get why we're off on another tangent here. And because it's not a 700-page book, it actually does mean that you are removing time from those core things in a way that is maybe noticeable. Nonetheless, some people who like the long 18th century, the 19th century novel, will really enjoy that and will find that a kind of interesting piece of history. Other people may find it less attractive. Nonetheless, I enjoyed this book. I thought it was really good fun. I think if you're looking at a 19th century book, precisely because it's not very long and because its stakes are fairly comprehensible, I would recommend The Warden quite highly as an introductory novel to the period. Probably not as highly as Cranford, which is genuinely quite short, or Pride and Prejudice or Emma, which are a bit longer. But I think it's up there with if you want to get to know that part of literature, The Warden is not a bad place to start, or maybe it's your second or third book. Anyway, if you have read this, or if you have read other Barsetshire novels, tell me what you think in the comments. Until next time.